What happens when a 10-day demolition notice hits the only storage your family has? You go cold in a way the mountain air can't explain, you read every word twice, and you realize the people behind it aren't just nitpicking wood and nails. They're swinging power like a shovel, and they're aiming at your home. I remember the exact moment the notice landed because the snow was falling in those thick, slow flakes that make everything sound muffled, like the world is holding its breath. I'd just come inside from clearing the steps for the third time that morning, boots wet, shoulders tired, and the kids' mittens hanging over the heater like tiny flags of surrender. When I checked the mailbox, I expected the usual pile of glossy flyers and a bill or two. Instead, there was one envelope that felt heavier than paper should. It had the association's seal stamped in the corner, the kind of official flair they used when they wanted something to sting. I stood in my entryway, shaking the snow off my jacket, and opened it right there. 10 days. Demolish your non-compliant structure by the end of the 10th day or the association will proceed with removal at your expense. The letter referenced Structural Rule 7.2 as casually as someone quoting a weather report. No empathy. No context. Just a deadline like a guillotine. And the shed they wanted gone wasn't some random weekend project. It was the only thing keeping our lives from overflowing into the house. Snow shovels, salt, sleds, tire chains, the emergency generator we used when the power lines iced over, boxes of winter gear we rotated by size as the kids grew. In a place where winter didn't visit, it lived here. The shed wasn't a luxury. It was survival. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was this weird, dizzy disbelief. Like maybe I'd stepped into somebody else's story. Because I knew the rulebook, and I knew the shed had a history in this community that went deeper than their neat little 10-day threat. I let the paper drop onto the kitchen counter. The house was warm. The stove clicked softly. Outside, the wind was already erasing my boot prints across the porch. I stared at the letter, then at the back window where the shed sat half buried in snow, its roof sloping cleanly to shed drifts like it was built for this exact life. The association wanted it demolished. I could feel my pulse in my ears, sharp and steady, and I realized they'd misread me. They thought I'd panic. They thought I'd beg for an extension. But I'd learned something living under this board: when they come at you with a clock, you don't just watch the hands. You look for the gears. I moved my family up to this mountain neighborhood 3 winters ago. We didn't come here chasing some postcard fantasy. We came because the job transfer was non-negotiable, the schools were solid, and the housing market down in the valley was a circus we couldn't afford. The neighborhood looked like a snow globe from a distance, cabins and craftsman homes tucked into evergreens, plowed roads that curved like a ski trail, porch lights glowing gold against long blue evenings. The association marketed quiet harmony and well-maintained common spaces. I'd had experience with associations before, nothing dramatic, just the usual reminders about trash cans and yard weeds. So I didn't think twice. The first thing you notice living here is that winter isn't a season, it's the operating system. Snow stacks along the streets into walls higher than your hood. The sun disappears early behind ridges, and your whole day shifts around daylight and plow schedules. Everyone has storage. Everyone has extra tools. Everyone has some version of a shed or tucked-away structure because the garages fill up fast. The second thing you notice is the board. I don't mean the idea of the board. I mean the personalities. The committee members treated this place like their private fiefdom. They didn't just enforce rules, they interpreted them with theatrical seriousness. The president, who I'll call Ms. R., had the kind of smile that could be friendly in a brochure and ice-cold in person. The treasurer, a man everyone called the treasurer because he liked the title more than his name, carried a clipboard like it was part of his skeleton. Then there was the architectural chair, Mr. D., who seemed to think he was preserving a national monument, not a neighborhood where kids made snow forts. They ran meetings that felt less like community check-ins and more like court. If you asked a question the wrong way, they'd answer like you'd confessed to a crime. If you disagreed, they'd remind you how lucky you were to live here. And if you were new, like we were, they treated you like a visitor who hadn't earned the right to relax. Still, I kept my head down at first. I shoveled. I nodded at neighbors. I went to a few meetings. I read the handbook cover to cover because I didn't want to give them ammunition. The thick binder sat on the top shelf of our pantry for months, my own version of a security blanket. I even highlighted the sections that seemed like the ones they'd swing hardest. Structural Rule 7.2 was one of them. I remember that because the line was so vague it practically begged to be weaponized. Accessory structures must not obstruct maintenance access or impact community sightlines. That was it. No measurements, no diagrams, no clear standards. Just a phrase that could mean anything to someone who wanted it to. The shed came with the property when we bought it. It was old, gray boards, warped door, the kind of thing you might repaint someday when life slowed down. The listing called it a storage outbuilding. The previous owners said it had been there for years and the association had never cared. I believed them. I didn't even think about it until the first spring thaw when I went to pull out the lawn tools and got a nasty surprise. One corner post had rotted so badly it crumbled under my hand. The roof sagged. We'd had a heavy snowpack that year, and the shed had basically survived on habit. If I left it, we'd be dealing with a collapse right when summer storms rolled in. I'm not a contractor, but I can read a level and follow a plan. So I did what any reasonable homeowner would do, I rebuilt it. I didn't expand the footprint. I didn't pour a new slab. I kept it the same size, same spot, same style. I even matched the exterior color to the house, a deep pine green that blended with the trees. I pulled a simple permit from the county because that's how I was raised. And before I started, I checked the handbook again. The rule said repairs to existing accessory structures were permitted without architectural review as long as the footprint didn't change. I had that line underlined in blue ink. So I rebuilt it over a couple weekends at the end of summer, with the smell of fresh cut wood mixing with the sharp mountain air. I worked early mornings before the sun got too high, and late evenings when the ridge shadows cooled everything off. Neighbors walked by and gave thumbs up. One guy told me it was about time someone fixed that eyesore. I felt proud, not because it was fancy, but because it was solid. I was doing right by my home. The shed stood straight after that, clean lines, a roof angle tuned for snow slide, a door that actually sealed. It became part of our routine. In October we packed it with winter gear. In November I ran a hook for hanging shovels so they'd dry. By December it was a mini warehouse for every bulky thing that didn't belong in a living room. The house breathed easier because of it. So did I. Apparently, so did the association, until someone decided not to. The trigger, I learned later, wasn't a surprise inspection or a new policy. It was one person with a gripe. In this neighborhood, the association hires a small landscaping crew that doubles as snow maintenance for common areas. Most of the time they're fine, quiet, efficient, the kind of people who just want to do their routes and go home before the next squall. The guy in charge of our section, though, had a reputation for complaining about anything that wasn't perfectly convenient for his machines. I'll call him the landscaper. He wasn't a board member, but he had the ear of the board, and around here that mattered more than titles. The first hint came in early January, right after a storm that dumped near a foot overnight. The sky that morning was a pale gray sheet, and the snow under my boots squeaked in that dry, brittle way it does at high elevation. I was in the driveway clearing a path for my car when I noticed the landscaper's plow idling on the street longer than usual. He walked up the side easement that runs between my fence and the neighbor's lot, a narrow lane the crew uses for access to a drainage ditch in summer and for pushing overflow snow in winter. He didn't knock. He didn't wave. He just stared at the shed from the easement like it had insulted his family. I tried to be polite. I stepped toward the gate, asked if he needed anything, if he wanted me to move my car. He gave me a look that said I was the inconvenience, not the giant drift behind him. He gestured toward the shed and said something about it blocking his sightline for backing the plow through the easement turn. Not a request. Not a conversation. A complaint, like he was reporting a stain. I reminded him the shed had been there forever, and I'd only repaired it. The footprint hadn't changed. The easement was still clear. There was at least 6 feet between the fence and the shed, same as before. He didn't care. He said he couldn't do his job with it there. He then wandered off, leaving me standing in the cold, holding my shovel like a prop in someone else's play. I chalked it up to a bad morning. It was storm season. People get cranky when they're buried in snow. I didn't realize I'd just been cast as the villain in his version of events. A week later, I got an email from the association office. Not a letter, not a warning. An email with a sterile subject line about accessory structure review. It asked me to submit photos and a description of recent construction in my backyard. The tone was polite in that passive way that makes your skin crawl. I knew what it was. Mr. D's fingerprints were all over it, the architectural chair who loved reviews. Still, I complied, because I had nothing to hide. I sent back photos from multiple angles, plus the county permit and a short note that it was a repair on an existing shed with no footprint change, per Handbook Section 4.1. I attached a scan of the highlighted page from my binder, the one I'd been clutching for months like a shield. Their reply was delayed. 3 days. Then 5. Then silence. In the meantime, little things started happening. The landscaper began stopping his plow right at my driveway entrance and leaving a ridge of compacted snow that took twice as long to clear. The easement behind my fence, which they normally kept open for drainage, started getting filled with piles pushed higher than previous storms. I had to dig a channel so meltwater wouldn't pool against my yard come spring. It felt petty, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I told myself it was just how the storms were stacking this year. That's the trick about living in a snowy place, nature always gives people an excuse to act like jerks. Then the treasurer approached me after a community meeting. I'd gone to that meeting because the board had been talking about raising dues for increased snow operations, and I wanted to know what that actually meant. The room smelled faintly of wet wool and old coffee, and the fluorescent lights buzzed like a trapped fly. Ms. R did her usual performance about community standards and shared responsibility. People asked questions about salt budgets and road wear. I mostly listened. As everyone was leaving, the treasurer drifted toward me in his slow, deliberate way. He said he'd heard about the shed and that the committee was concerned. His concern wasn't about safety. It was about optics. He mentioned Structural Rule 7.2 without even checking the paper in his hand, like he'd rehearsed it. He said the shed might impede maintenance routes and disrupt scenic consistency, and that they were looking into it. I gave him the same facts I'd already emailed. Repairs. Existing structure. No footprint change. County permit. Handbook allowance. He nodded, but the nod was empty. He told me they'd be in touch and walked away before I could finish my sentence, leaving me with that sticky feeling you get when someone is already done with you. That night I reread the handbook. I flipped through my highlighted pages, tracing the old lines. I could practically predict which vague phrases they'd twist. Rule 7.2 was the hammer they were warming up. The clause about existing repairs was the nail I planned to hold on to. I went to bed thinking it would end with a mild warning and a reminder to keep the easement clear. I was wrong. 2 mornings later was when the envelope showed up. The 10-day demolition notice. The one that turned my house into a ticking clock. I took the letter outside into the cold to make sure I wasn't misreading it under indoor light. The sky had cleared overnight, and the sun glittered off snowbanks like shards of glass. I stood on the porch, breath clouding, and read every line slowly. The notice claimed the shed was new construction and non-compliant because it obstructed maintenance access and altered visual corridors. There was no measurement. No photo. No attempt at proving anything. Just the rule number and a deadline. Worse, it had a line at the bottom about costs. If they removed it, I'd be billed for labor, disposal, and administrative processing. Administrative processing was their favorite phrase, the blank check they used to make every annoyance expensive. I didn't know how high the bill could go, but I knew one thing: in this neighborhood, association expenses ballooned like snow drifts. This was officially an HOA nightmare, and I could feel it trying to swallow my winter whole. My spouse saw the paper in my hand and asked what happened. I didn't want to dump panic on the kids, so I waved it off until they were busy. But inside, my brain was already sprinting. 10 days in a mountain winter is not 10 days of normal life. It's 10 days of storms, 10 days where a truck might not even reach your backyard without turning into a sled. It's 10 days where the shed would be covered by enough snow to make demolition a joke. They knew that. They wrote the deadline anyway. That's when I stopped thinking of this as a rule issue and started seeing it as a power move. The board could have asked for a site review. They could have set a meeting. They could have offered a compromise about the easement. Instead, they went straight to demolition. That leap told me everything. They weren't interested in solving a problem. They were interested in reminding me who they thought was in charge. I looked at the shed again. The wind stirred powder off the roof in little swirls, soft as smoke. Behind it, the evergreens stood tall, indifferent. I thought about the landscaper's stare. The treasurer's empty nod. The weeks of silence. How quickly a complaint became a threat. Then I carried the notice inside, set it flat on the counter, and opened my binder one more time. I wasn't going to argue with feelings. I wasn't going to plead about storage or weather or family needs. If they were coming at me with Rule 7.2, I was going to meet them on paper. Because paper is the only language these boards respect. I pulled out the association handbook, the county permit folder, and my email thread. I arranged them like evidence on the table. The handbook was thick, corners dog-eared, my notes in the margins. The permit had dates and stamps. The email had their own words asking for documentation I'd already provided. If they wanted a story about compliance, I had receipts. The more I read the notice, the more I noticed what it didn't say. No reference to the repair allowance. No acknowledgement of the old shed. And a very careful word choice, they kept calling it rebuilt, not repaired. Like they were trying to force a definition before I could. I couldn't shake the sense that this was coordinated. Not just the landscaper huffing. Not just a bored architectural chair. This was the board using an employee's irritation as cover for something bigger, control, precedent, maybe even intimidation for the next new family who dared to touch a hammer. I kept my face calm that day. I shoveled. I waved at neighbors. I didn't post in the community chat. On the outside, I looked like I was swallowing it. Inside, I was counting backward from 10 and hunting for the one sentence they'd overlooked. 10 days sounds like a lot until you realize every sunrise is a threat. And the board was betting that by day 10 I'd cave, because deadlines make people feel small. Turns out, deadlines also make me read harder. I stayed up late after everyone else slept, flipping through sections of the handbook I'd skimmed before. Maintenance access rules. Architectural review standards. Easement definitions. The language was dense and smug, the way committees write when they want to sound smarter than your common sense. I marked passages with sticky tabs, created a little map of cross-references, and kept circling back to a quiet set of definitions near the back that I'd never really noticed. Somewhere in those final pages was the hinge I was looking for. I didn't know it yet, but as I traced my highlighter along that text, I felt an odd calm settle in. Not because I had the answer, but because I was finally in motion. The board wanted demolition. They wanted to move fast and make me feel powerless in the snow. But I'd spent 3 winters learning how this place worked. Winter teaches you patience. It teaches you to plan ahead. And most of all, it teaches you that when someone tries to push you downhill, you plant your feet and look for rock under the drift. By the time I closed the binder, the clock on the stove read after midnight. The house was silent except for the distant hum of wind against the siding. I stared at the notice one last time, then slid it into a clear folder with my other documents. Day 1 was over. 9 left. And somewhere in the rules they loved so much, I was pretty sure there was a way to turn their own words into a wall they couldn't plow through. Day 2 started with the kind of dawn that looks innocent but isn't. The light was soft and blew off the snowfields, and the temperature had dropped overnight so hard that the trees sounded like they were cracking in their sleep. I made coffee, pulled on a hoodie, and opened the binder again at the kitchen table. The demolition notice had a date at the top, January 14th, and a tracking stamp on the back showing it was processed 2 days earlier. That mattered. It wasn't a spontaneous complaint. It was planned. I slid that final notice dated January 14th into the front pocket of my folder like a chess piece I'd need later. I didn't call anyone. Not yet. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of hearing me scramble. My plan was simple: find out what they were really claiming, and where they'd cut corners to do it. Structural Rule 7.2 was their anchor, so I traced every other rule that referenced it. The handbook was built like a maze, and I'd learned that boards love mazes because confusion makes enforcement easier. I pulled up the definitions section I'd been studying the night before. There it was again, a quiet little line that defined new construction as any accessory structure that alters footprint, height, or location relative to the original approved design. That line was the hinge. They were calling my shed new construction, but I hadn't changed footprint, height, or location. I'd repaired an existing structure in the same place and size. By their own definitions, the shed couldn't be labeled new unless they could prove I'd expanded it. That definition referenced another clause, one I'd never noticed because it was tucked under an appendix about maintenance easements. It said any accessory structure existing prior to the adoption of Structural Rule 7.2 was considered a grandfathered improvement so long as it remained within its original envelope. Translation: if the shed existed before the rule was written, and I kept it the same size, it was protected. I actually laughed, low and tired, because it felt like finding a hidden door in a house you already lived in. The snow outside was steady, the heater vent hissed softly, and my whole body unclenched in a way I didn't even realize it had tightened. But I couldn't celebrate yet. A loophole on paper doesn't help if you can't prove the shed was older than the rule. So the next task was evidence. I dug out our home purchase file and the old inspection report. The inspector had taken a photo of the backyard, and in that photo the shed was right there, leaning and tired but unmistakable. The report was dated 4 years earlier. That predated the current handbook by at least 2 revisions. I printed that page, circled the shed in red, and slid it behind the notice. Then I opened the association's online archive. This part wasn't secret, just boring enough that nobody but a stressed homeowner would ever scroll through it. I found meeting minutes from 6 years ago where the board discussed updating standards for accessory structures due to visibility concerns. That was the birth of Rule 7.2. I printed that too. I wasn't hunting for drama, I was building a timeline they couldn't argue with. By late morning I had a tidy stack: the January 14th final notice, my county permit, the homeowner inspection photo, and the old minutes showing Rule 7.2 was newer than my shed. It wasn't a courtroom, but it was a story with dates. Boards hate stories they don't control. I still didn't contact them. I took a walk instead, the air sharp against my cheeks and the snow squeaking underfoot, to see the easement from every angle they might try to claim was blocked. From the street, you could barely see the shed through the trees. From the easement itself, there was clear path around it. If anything, it sat farther from the lane now because I'd straightened the rotting wall rather than letting it slump outward. That meant their maintenance access argument was smoke. Whether it was the landscaper pouting or the board posturing, the claim didn't match reality. I got home with ice gathering along my eyelashes and found a second email in my inbox. This one wasn't a notice. It was a reminder, cheerful as a threat, that my 10-day compliance period had begun and that timely action will prevent additional costs. The way they italicized additional costs told me their real play: money pressure. Here's what they were really counting on: that the fear of a giant removal bill would push me into tearing down my own shed. And the minute money enters the room, you stop thinking in feelings and start thinking in receipts. So I started drafting a response. Not a rant. Not a plea. A clean, boring, bullet-pointed letter that did one thing: force them to meet me on their own definitions. I cited the definition of new construction, quoted the grandfather clause, attached the inspection photo and the old minutes, and stated that the shed existed before Rule 7.2 and remained in its original envelope. I also pointed out that my repair permit from the county supported that I had done a repair, not an expansion. I kept it dry enough to be unfunny. The board lived for emotional bait. I wasn't giving them a bite. Before I hit send, I printed one more thing, the association's own maintenance map that showed the easement width. I'd found it in a PDF from a snow routing proposal last year, and it had a diagram confirming that the maintenance path was not fixed to a single sightline. It was a buffer zone. If their landscaper wanted a bigger turning radius, that was a personnel issue, not a structural violation. I added the map to my packet and sent the email with everything attached. Then I walked away from my phone like it was radioactive. Day 3 came and went with no reply. Day 4 brought a reply, but not the one I expected. The association emailed back with a short note that said they'd received my materials and would review them at the next scheduled committee session. The next scheduled session was in 9 days. Which was conveniently one day after my demolition deadline. It was slick in that bureaucratic way. They were trying to outwait the countdown. If they refused to acknowledge my evidence until after day 10, they could say I missed the window and proceed anyway. I read the email twice, the faint smell of pine from the fireplace mixing with the metallic cold sneaking under the door. The move was obvious now, not about compliance, but about timing. If I let their schedule control the game, my proof wouldn't matter. So I checked the handbook again for timelines. There was a section about enforcement procedure that I'd skimmed before because it seemed routine. But routine is where loopholes hide. The enforcement clause said that once a homeowner submits a written dispute with supporting documentation, all enforcement actions pause until a formal review is completed. It was meant to protect owners from exactly this kind of bulldozing. I hadn't named my email a dispute on purpose, because I was focused on facts, but I had clearly contested the violation and attached proof. That should trigger the pause. Unless they tried to pretend it didn't. Which is why I followed up immediately with a second email, this time explicitly calling it a written dispute under enforcement procedure, and I quoted the pause clause right in the body. I attached the first packet again. I even copied the association manager, not because I trusted them, but because I wanted a digital footprint they couldn't erase. Then I waited through another storm. The mountain went quiet that evening after the plows passed, the streetlights casting a pale halo on fresh snow. I stood at the window watching flakes swirl in the wind, and I felt something shift from anxiety into focus. They were making procedural moves. Fine. I could do that too. On day 5, they finally called, but not to talk. The association manager left a voicemail saying the dispute had been noted, but the demolition deadline still stood because the structure presents an active access hazard. Active hazard was a phrase their handbook never used. It was made-up urgency. I didn't call back. Instead, I went deeper. If they were claiming hazard, they'd have to document it in some official way. That meant agenda notes, internal memos, or a board vote. The association's bylaws required enforcement items to be listed on the board agenda before action. If they were going to remove my shed, it had to be on paper somewhere. So I requested the next board agenda in writing, citing the transparency section that allowed homeowners to view enforcement-related agendas. Again, calm, boring, procedural. It's funny how much power you get in these situations by simply reading the fine print and using it. The association didn't answer that request. But 2 days later, an agenda appeared on the community portal for the upcoming meeting. And sure enough, late in the list under Enforcement Actions, there was a generic line, Accessory Structure Violation, Lot 27. That was me. The line wasn't detailed, but it was a breadcrumb and it confirmed they were planning to act before any review. I printed that agenda excerpt immediately. Evidence prop number 2, tucked under escalation, and the one I knew I might need when this got uglier. I took a pen and wrote the date on top in big block letters. Then I stared at it long enough to feel my patience fray. Because now it wasn't just a threat. It was a plotted event. A scheduled demolition against a family's only storage in the middle of winter, all because one man wanted a cleaner turn for his plow. The absurdity was heavy, but so was the clarity. I was dealing with an association that didn't want to be wrong. And people who don't want to be wrong will always double down before they back off. Which is exactly what they did next. Day 6 was when they started trying to make me feel alone. The association posted a community reminder in the neighborhood bulletin about maintaining scenic corridors and keeping maintenance easements clear. No names. No addresses. Just a finger pointed vaguely in my direction. I knew it was about me because they attached a stock photo of a backyard shed with a red X over it. It was childish and theatrical. But it did what it was meant to do. People started looking. That afternoon, as the air turned silver before another snow band rolled in, I noticed neighbors slowing their cars by my house. Not obvious rubbernecking, but that cautious, curious glance you do when you think someone might be in trouble and you don't want to ask. One couple walked their dog past my fence twice. Another neighbor texted me a friendly "What's up?" The board had lit a flare, and now the whole street was squinting at it. I hated that part more than the notice itself. Because when an association can't win on facts, it tries to win on vibe. It tries to turn you into an example. It wants you to feel the social pressure like a second frost on your skin. I didn't take the bait. I answered neighbors lightly, said there was a misunderstanding, that I'd submitted documentation, and that it would be handled. I kept it calm because I wasn't going to arm the gossip machine with my panic. But inside, I was furious, not in a loud, stomping way, in a precise way, like a blade being sharpened. Mizar had done this kind of thing before. I'd seen it. A neighbor last winter had left a trailer in their driveway for a week while their dad recovered from surgery. The board sent a warning, then posted a general vehicle storage reminder to shame them. Another family had repainted their porch a shade too light and gotten a color palette notice, plus a public note about preserving rustic harmony. The pattern was always the same: private threat, then public pressure. This wasn't maintenance. This was theater. I decided that day that I wasn't going to let them write the only public narrative. So I made my own quiet move. I emailed the association manager requesting a formal hearing under the dispute clause and asked that it be scheduled within the 10-day period as required. The bylaws had a line about timely hearings when demolition is threatened. I quoted it. If they refused to schedule it, that refusal would be another thing I could document. They replied 3 hours later. No hearing, they said. The board would address the matter during open comments at the upcoming meeting. That wasn't a hearing. That was a trap. Open comments are a stage where they control the mic, the clock, and the mood. And I knew exactly how they'd play it: let me talk for 2 minutes, nod politely, then vote behind closed doors. It was so transparent I almost respected the audacity. Almost. That night I rechecked the enforcement pause clause and the hearing requirement. They were in violation of their own process. If I wanted to go scorched earth, I could. But scorched earth makes you messy. Messy makes you lose. I didn't need scorched, I needed precise. So I prepared for the meeting like it was a cross-exam. I printed 3 copies of everything: notice, dispute email, inspection photo, minutes, maintenance map, agenda excerpt, hearing request, their denial. I organized it in a slim folder with sticky tabs, each labeled in plain language. I wrote a simple timeline on a separate sheet with dates and rule numbers. The snow outside deepened, the wind rattling the eaves in quick pulses, and I sat at my table with a pen in my hand feeling like I was assembling a parachute after the plane already started struggling. Day 7 arrived with a clear sky, which in this place doesn't mean calm. It means the cold has teeth. I dropped the kids at school, then parked at the association office and slid a hard copy of my dispute into their drop box, stamped date and time on the top. If they tried to say they never got it, I was about to be the most organized person they'd ever underestimated. 2 hours later, I watched from my window as the landscaper came down the easement again. He didn't linger this time. He walked straight to the shed, measured something with his boot steps, and snapped photos on his phone. The casual way he did it, like he was hunting proof rather than seeking truth, made my stomach knot. He wasn't gathering facts. He was gathering angles. And angles are what boards use to justify whatever decision they already made. When they can't bully you into compliance, they try to embarrass you into it. And trust me, the next week was going to be less about rules and more about how badly they wanted to make me look like the villain. The meeting was in 2 days. My deadline was in 3. The board was moving like a snowplow downhill, and I could feel the moment approaching where my quiet paper game had to turn into something louder. Not dramatic. Not messy. Just loud enough to stop the blade. The board meeting hit like a blizzard you see coming but still can't prepare for. The community room was packed. Winter meetings usually pull a crowd because everyone has opinions about plow hours and salt. But this time the buzz felt sharper. People were whispering, shifting in their chairs. I could hear the faint scrape of boots drying against the radiator and the low hum of a heater fighting the cold leaking in every time the door opened. I sat near the back, folder on my lap. I wasn't there to perform. I was there to interrupt a performance. Ms. R opened with her usual speech about standards and community pride. Then they rolled through routine items. The treasurer read a line about budget overspend on snow routes. Mr. D talked about porch railings. They were delaying on purpose, saving the enforcement line for last while making the room tired. Finally they reached accessory structure violation, lot 27. Mr. D started describing the shed as a newly erected outbuilding that restricts maintenance operations and disrupts visual corridors. He kept it vague, leaning on big emotional words instead of specifics. I could feel eyes turning toward me. When open comments started, I stood. My knees didn't shake, but my hands were cold from gripping the folder. I walked to the front with the quiet steadiness you use on ice. I didn't accuse. I didn't rant. I laid out facts. I explained that the shed existed before Rule 7.2, supported by the inspection photo dated 4 years prior. I referenced the meeting minutes showing the rule's adoption came later. I reminded them the footprint, height, and location had not changed. I specified repairs to existing accessory structures are permitted without architectural review. I pointed out that enforcement should pause during a dispute and that a formal hearing was required before demolition action. I held up the January 14th notice and the agenda excerpt listing my lot as an enforcement action despite the pause clause. No speeches. Just a clean timeline. Ms. R's face tightened in that way that looks polite to strangers and furious to anyone who recognizes the muscle pattern. Mr. D tried to redirect by saying the issue wasn't age, it was access. So I pivoted to the maintenance map and described the easement width. I said the shed remained outside the easement buffer and that access had not been obstructed, and if the landscaper was finding routes difficult, that indicated a route planning issue rather than a structure hazard. The treasurer interrupted to say the board had the authority to interpret sightlines. I calmly pointed back to the definition of new construction and asked how sightline interpretation could override the grandfather clause. I didn't sound snarky. I sounded curious. That difference matters. Curiosity makes them explain themselves. Explaining is where they can trip. They didn't answer. Ms. R said the board would take that under advisement and move to close comments. That was it. No hearing. No vote in the open. Just a polite shut door. I walked back to my chair feeling like I'd just thrown a bucket of cold water on a campfire. It didn't kill the fire, but it changed the oxygen. After the meeting, people approached me quietly. One neighbor, a retiree who'd lived here almost 20 years, told me the board had overreached on structures before and that I was right to push back. Another said the easement argument was nonsense. These weren't grand allies, but they were proof that the board's social shame campaign wasn't fully landing. It helped, even if it didn't solve the problem. I got home after dark. The moonlight on the snow was bright enough to see by, and the wind had eased to a low hiss through pine needles. I checked my email. There was a new message from the association, sent during the meeting, which meant they'd written it ahead of time. It said, after review, the board upheld the demolition notice. The deadline remained in effect. Failure to comply would result in removal and billing. No mention of evidence. No reference to definitions. No acknowledgement of the pause clause. They had decided before I spoke. It was infuriating in a way that felt clinical. But when I read it again, I noticed something else. A single sentence near the bottom said, Given the structure's interference with contracted maintenance operations, the association will proceed under vendor access provisions. Vendor access provisions. That wasn't Rule 7.2. That was a different section. A section I hadn't dug into yet. They'd shifted their footing mid-swing. And that meant they were scrambling. Day 9 was my favorite kind of day in a fight, the day your opponent tells you more than they realize. I found the vendor access section in the handbook. It was supposed to cover emergency access for maintenance vendors in common areas, not private yards. It said the board could remove obstructions from common property to ensure contractor routes remained clear, but only on common property. The authority didn't extend to privately owned improvements unless those improvements were already proven non-compliant under structural rules. They were trying to wedge a common property clause into a private yard enforcement. It was like using a parking rule to tow someone's car from their garage. Which meant if I could show the shed was compliant or grandfathered, something I'd already done, then vendor access provisions couldn't apply. Their own sentence was a legal pretzel on paper. Not actual legal advice, just basic logic they didn't bother to check because they assumed I wouldn't read it. At that moment, I stopped feeling only defensive. I started seeing the outline of an offensive move. The theme of this whole mess was abuse of power dressed up as maintenance. The board wasn't trying to keep the neighborhood safe, they were trying to expand their reach by precedent. If they could demolish my grandfathered shed without due process, they could demolish anyone's anything whenever a contractor complained. They weren't just targeting me. They were testing how far the line could slide. So I wrote one more letter. A final dispute response, delivered both by email and by certified Dropbox stamp. I stated that the board's decision violated enforcement pause and hearing procedure. I clarified that vendor access provisions were limited to common property and could not be invoked absent a proven structural violation. I attached the relevant excerpts with highlights. I requested, again, an immediate formal hearing and a written explanation of how my evidence was being dismissed. I wasn't expecting them to suddenly get reasonable. I was building a record. Then I did the thing they never expect, I talked to other homeowners. Not in a dramatic group chat explosion. Just quiet conversations. I asked a few longtime residents if they'd ever had accessory structures challenged, especially ones predating Rule 7.2. 2 people said yes. One had gotten a warning about a woodpile shelter and had fought it off by showing pre-rule photos. Another said the board had tried to force removal of a small tool hut but backed down after a neighbor pointed out the grandfather clause. So the loophole wasn't hypothetical. It had been used before. That was the kind of precedent associations hate because it turns their interpretation discretion into a constraint. I asked if they'd be willing to write short statements confirming those incidents. Both agreed, irritated that the board was trying this again. I didn't coach them. I just asked them to describe what happened and roughly when. Those statements became evidence prop number 3, retaliation era preloaded, but I tucked it in now because I knew I'd need it soon. When I finished collecting them, I sat on my porch steps with the folder in my lap and watched a faint flurry ride the wind across the yard. The shed looked sturdy, calm, oblivious to the drama wrapped around it. I felt the countdown pressing in my chest. Tomorrow was day 10. And I couldn't stop thinking about one question: if they tried to send a crew, how would I prevent it without turning this into a screaming match on my own lawn? I didn't want a spectacle. But I also wasn't about to let them bulldoze a loophole that protected more than my storage. That night, I opened the bylaws again and found a line about emergency injunction requests through internal association arbitration. The wording wasn't fancy. It basically said homeowners could request an immediate stay of enforcement when irreparable property action was threatened, pending a formal hearing. Internal stay. That was it. That was the pressure valve they'd overlooked. It wasn't a court thing. It was entirely within their own process, a mechanism they couldn't deny without admitting they were ignoring the bylaws. So before sunrise, I drafted a stay request and prepared to hand-deliver it to the association office first thing. With the clock about to hit day 10, I wasn't just fighting for a shed anymore. If they ignored this stay request, it would prove they were willing to break their own rules to punish a homeowner, and that kind of procedural overreach has consequences nobody likes to explain out loud. The next morning, the cold was so sharp it made the air look crystalline. I drove to the association office while the plows were still clearing intersections, and I parked in a spot half buried by drifted powder. My hands were steady as I walked up to their door. I slid the stay request through the slot, stamped a time photo on my phone, and left without waiting for anyone to greet me. I'd learned by now that giving them a face to push on was optional. Giving them paper was not. Then I went home and waited. Not passively. Strategically. I put my folder by the front door. I charged my phone. I checked the easement path and made sure nothing in my yard could be seen as an obstruction. I didn't want to hand them a different excuse. Around mid-morning, I saw a truck in the distance. White cab, yellow hazard lights. My stomach dipped like an elevator because in this neighborhood, hazard lights are never for good news. The truck rolled past my house slowly, then parked a few homes down. Two men got out. They wore heavy jackets with a maintenance logo I didn't recognize. They looked around, talked to each other, and one pointed in my direction. This was it. They were about to test whether my stay request mattered. I stepped onto my porch, boots crunching on the packed snow. I didn't run toward them. I didn't shout. I just stood where I was visible, holding the folder like a shield made of paper. The men approached the easement gate. One of them glanced at me and slowed. He looked uncertain, not aggressive. That uncertainty told me they weren't storming in with confidence. They were contractors who'd been handed an order and maybe not the full story. I raised my hand in a calm stop gesture. I didn't say anything dramatic. I simply indicated that enforcement was in formal dispute and that a stay request had been filed that morning, and that they should confirm authorization with the association manager before touching private property. They hesitated. One checked his phone. The other stepped back from the gate. They walked away to make a call. I stood there in the thin sunlight feeling my heart thud against my ribs, but I didn't move. The snow rustled softly in the breeze, and the whole neighborhood felt like it was holding still. Whatever call they were making was going to decide whether this tipped into chaos or into the next phase of my plan. And either way, I was done letting the board play the only hand at the table. The two men by the truck stayed on their phone longer than any contractor ever wants to. The wind was light but sharp, and it sifted powder across my porch like someone brushing flour over a countertop. I watched them pace in a small circle, shoulders hunched against the cold, heads dipped toward the screen. They weren't taking directions from me, and I didn't expect them to. But they also weren't charging into my backyard with confidence. After a few minutes, they got back into the truck and drove off without another glance. No confrontation, no drama. Just a quiet retreat, like they'd been told to stand down until someone higher up could sort out the mess. I went inside and let myself breathe. Not because I thought it was over. Because I knew that moment had forced a decision point for the board. Either they'd acknowledge the stay request and schedule the hearing they were trying to dodge, or they'd ignore it and risk exposing themselves to the entire neighborhood as a committee that doesn't follow its own bylaws. I checked my email again. Nothing. Not even an automated reply. By noon, the snow clouding the ridge had thickened, and I could hear distant plows grinding somewhere on the main loop road. My phone finally buzzed. It was an email from the association manager. The subject line was short and aggressive: immediate compliance required. The message said my stay request was denied because the board considered the shed an ongoing operational hazard, and that demolition would proceed as soon as weather allows. They added a new threat: daily fines would begin at midnight for non-compliance, and I would be billed for any contractor delays. They were escalating on purpose. If they couldn't tear it down immediately, they'd bleed me with money. Their denial didn't cite any bylaw. Didn't explain why a formal hearing wasn't being provided. It wasn't a decision, it was a shove. I stared at the screen until my coffee went cold. The heater clicked on, the house smelled faintly of damp gloves drying near the vent, and I felt the old anger rise. Not hot. Focused. Because they'd just done something I could use. They denied a stay without a hearing. They threatened fines without resolving a dispute. They put it in writing. And now I had a clear, time-stamped example of procedural abuse, framed in their own words. I added it to my folder, right after the agenda excerpt. My stack was turning into a story they couldn't unwrite. I also noticed something else in that denial. They said demolition would proceed as soon as weather allows. That line was softer than their original 10-day deadline. It gave me a breathing pocket. If they were forced to wait for conditions, their urgency wasn't truly about hazard. It was about control. So I did two things. First, I sent a reply acknowledging their denial and reiterating that enforcement must pause under dispute procedure, and that fines cannot be assessed until the dispute is formally resolved. I attached the exact clause. Again, no emotion. Just a mirror. Second, I walked the neighborhood. Not to rally a mob. To build a quiet consensus. I talked to the longtime neighbor who'd already given me a statement. Then I talked to 3 others on my street, people I'd waved at all winter but never really sat with. I showed them the notice and the handbook section about grandfathered improvements. I asked them if they were comfortable reading the definition with me. Every one of them had some variation of the same reaction, disbelief first, then irritation. Because even if my shed wasn't their concern, the board's behavior was. Nobody likes the precedent of sudden demolition threats in deep winter. One neighbor mentioned an old tool shack behind their garage that had existed since before the current committee. Another had a wood storage lean-to exactly where their plow route ran closest. They were thinking forward now, imagining the same hammer swung at them. By late afternoon, the same 3 neighbors offered to sign a short, respectful petition asking the board to follow dispute procedure and halt enforcement until a hearing. I didn't ask them to. They volunteered. It wasn't a coup. It was a request for process. I typed it up that evening, a simple half-page note with no drama, no accusations. The snow outside hissed softly against the windows as a new storm started to push in. I printed 5 copies and put them in envelopes. Day 10 had passed, but their line had blurred. They were out of weather, out of patience, and, if they ignored this petition, about to be out of cover. They tried to beat me with a 10-day clock. Now that clock was gone, and they still didn't have a clean way to win without looking like they were breaking their own rules, which meant the real deadline was about to shift onto them. The next morning, I dropped the petition into the association drop box along with the neighbor statements and a final copy of my dispute packet. A pale sun broke through the clouds for a minute, and the snow glittered on the sidewalk like it was daring me to slip. I didn't. I walked steady. I didn't hear back that day. Or the day after. But I did see something that mattered. The landscaper's plow route changed. Instead of turning into the easement behind my fence, he began backing from the other end, coming in from the main loop road where the turn was wider. It wasn't convenient for him, but it worked. And it proved what I'd been saying from the start: access wasn't blocked. He just didn't like adjusting. In a normal world, that would end the issue. The contractor found a different route, hazard gone, done. But in this world, it gave the board a different problem. If their own vendor was adapting, their active hazard narrative crumbled. They'd need a new excuse, or they'd need to retreat. They chose excuse. On day 13, I got another notice. This one was titled Revised Enforcement Action, which basically meant we're rewriting the story. Instead of claiming obstruction, it claimed the shed violated Uniform Rustic Character Standards because the repaired siding was too modern in finish. That was laughable. The color matched the house. The siding was basic wood. Their complaint was as subjective as taste. They weren't enforcing a rule. They were searching for one. I didn't get upset. I got interested. Because searching meant they were unsure, and unsure people often make careless moves. So I read the rustic character section carefully. The standard applied to newly constructed accessory structures and specified approval for exterior finishes. It didn't apply to grandfathered repairs. It even referenced the same definition of new construction I'd already used. They'd looped back to the same trap. I replied with a single paragraph: the shed is grandfathered, repairs do not reset character review, and the association's shift in rationale further supports that the original 7.2 claim was unsubstantiated. I attached my timeline again. Then I waited. 2 evenings later, I received an email invitation to a special compliance hearing scheduled for the following Monday. They were finally giving me the hearing they'd tried to dodge. Not because they suddenly cared about fairness, but because the neighbor's petition had turned up the light. They needed to look procedural again. Fine. I'd take a hearing. I spent the weekend preparing like I was about to take a test I already knew the answers to. I rehearsed my timeline out loud while washing dishes. I organized the folder so I could flip to any page in under 3 seconds. I printed a clean copy of the grandfather clause and taped it inside the folder cover. The night before the hearing, the storm cleared and the moon came out sharp, white, and bright over the ridgeline. I stood at the window watching frost glint on the trees, and for the first time in 2 weeks my fear didn't show up. Instead, I felt something close to amusement. Because by pushing this so far, the board had created a bigger stage. And paper doesn't just protect you in a boardroom. It traps them in their own words. The hearing took place in the same community room, but the vibe was different. The air smelled of melted snow and stale coffee, and the chairs were arranged in a semicircle like a theater pretending not to be one. Ms. R sat at the head. The treasurer next to her. Mr. D had a stack of papers that looked like he was trying to intimidate me with thickness. 2 neighbors attended quietly, seated in the back. They didn't speak unless asked, but their presence mattered. The committee was aware of it. Ms. R opened by restating the violation claims. She tried to frame the shed as new construction. Mr. D added that its profile disrupted corridor sightlines. The treasurer mentioned budget strain caused by route inefficiencies. I waited until they finished. Then I laid my folder on the table and walked through the timeline again, slow, steady, in order. Inspection report photo showing the shed existed 4 years ago. Board minutes showing Rule 7.2 was adopted later. Handbook definition of new construction requiring a footprint, height, or location change. My permit showing a repair. Maintenance map showing the easement buffer and no obstruction. Agenda excerpt proving they scheduled demolition during a dispute. Stay denial email showing they attempted to fine me without a hearing. Neighbor statements describing prior use of the same grandfather clause in earlier disputes. Whenever they tried to interrupt, I paused and asked if they wanted me to stop because I was reading directly from their bylaws. That phrasing worked like a break. Nobody wants to be on record saying, "Yes, stop reading the rules." They let me talk. Ms. R then asked how I could prove the shed's original envelope hadn't changed. I told her I'd remeasured the footprint from the original slab line visible in the soil at thaw, and I offered to provide the measurements. Not because I had to, but because transparency makes their suspicion look silly. Mr. D tried to say repairs were so substantial, they reset approval. I pointed to the exact repair allowance clause and asked where substantial was defined. It wasn't. I didn't say that with attitude. I said it with plain curiosity. The treasurer pivoted to money, saying contractor delays were costing the community. I asked for receipts. Specifically, I asked for documented invoices showing added costs directly caused by my shed, compared to routing alternatives. I reminded them the landscaper had already adjusted his route, proving alternatives existed. He didn't have invoices. Then I slid the petition across the table. 5 homeowners had signed it, asking the board to follow due process. I didn't perform with it. I just said the community expected transparent enforcement, not shifting rationales. The room went quiet. Only the soft click of the heater and the faint sound of boots shifting in snowmelt puddles. Ms. R asked for a short recess to review my documents. They stepped into the side room. And I sat there with my neighbors behind me, listening to the muffled shapes of their conversation through the thin wall. I couldn't hear words, only tones. Short, sharp, controlled. The sound of people realizing they were cornered by their own binder. They came back 10 minutes later. Ms. R announced that based on submitted documentation, the shed would be recognized as a grandfathered accessory structure and no demolition would proceed. She said future repairs would require a courtesy notice to the architectural committee. It was a retreat dressed as reasonableness. But it was still a retreat. I nodded calmly, thanked them for the decision, and asked for the decision in writing, referencing the dispute closure clause. They agreed. There was no apology. There never is. Boards like this don't apologize. They rebrand their defeat as a clarification. But I didn't need an apology. I needed the shed safe and the power grab exposed. As I gathered my folder, Ms. R added one more line: the landscaper's concerns were valid, and the board was reviewing route policies. That was her way of saving face. Let her have it. She'd already lost the only thing that mattered. Outside, the air was crisp and clean, and the sun was bright enough to throw white sparks off every snowbank. My neighbor patted my shoulder once, quiet support without making it a spectacle. We walked out like the storm had passed. They didn't back down because they grew a conscience. They backed down because their own rules made them look reckless, and the fines they threatened could have boomeranged right back into the community budget if anyone pushed harder. Money changes everything. The written decision arrived that evening. It was official, stamped, and annoyingly neutral. It confirmed the shed's grandfathered status and cancelled the enforcement action. It also said daily fines would not be assessed and that the dispute was closed. I printed 2 copies, one for my file and one for the freezer, because in a snowy place you learn to store your victories like food. You'd think that would be the end. But people like Ms. R don't just move on. Not when a homeowner lights up their soft spots. Not when a quiet fight makes them look sloppy. So I stayed alert. 2 days later, the association posted an update in the bulletin saying they had resolved a structure compliance matter through collaborative review. The language was glossy and vague. But then they added a new policy draft beneath it: all accessory structure repairs exceeding 30% material replacement shall require pre-approval. 30%. That number wasn't in any existing standard. They'd made it up to patch the hole I'd used. Here's the part they didn't consider: policy changes can't retroactively punish people. And policy drafts still need homeowner votes to become enforceable. They were trying to scare everyone into future compliance without doing the boring democratic work. I knew because I'd read the amendment procedure in the bylaws. It required a community vote, with a quorum, and a 30-day comment window. So I calmly emailed the association manager asking where the comment window notice was and when the vote would be scheduled. I copied the neighborhood rep list, because transparency is contagious. Within hours, a second bulletin posted, adding a public comment period and a tentative vote date. They didn't thank me. They just corrected themselves. That was my quiet revenge, forcing them to follow the rules they liked to weaponize. It wasn't dramatic. It was effective. And it had ripple effects. Neighbors began asking more questions at meetings. Someone challenged a fine about a porch chair rule and won. Another homeowner pushed back on a landscaping citation and forced a hearing first. The board started using fewer blanket announcements full of shame, because now people knew what they were seeing. The landscaper avoided my easement entirely for the rest of the season. When he did pass my fence, he didn't glare at the shed anymore. He just worked. Spring came slowly, as it always does here. The snowdrift softened into gray piles, meltwater ran like tiny rivers down the gutter lines, and the shed finally reappeared from its white blanket looking exactly the same as it had all winter: solid, quiet, and very much still mine. I spent one afternoon reorganizing it, feeling the wood warm under my palm as sunlight hit the siding. The smell of pine sap and wet soil mixed in the air. I hung the shovels back on their hooks and laughed to myself at the thought that this tiny building had kicked loose a whole power struggle. If this was a Karen neighbor drama plot, it was the kind where the villain trips over their own script. I'm not pretending the fight was free. Those 2 weeks sat on my chest like a second winter. I lost sleep. I snapped at my spouse a couple times for no reason besides stress. The kids picked up on the tension even when I tried to hide it. And the way the board made me feel watched in my own yard left a sour aftertaste that took longer to fade than the snow. But I also learned something that feels useful in any version of community life: power depends on people not reading. The moment you read, really read, your world changes. You stop being an easy target and become a person with leverage. For a while after the hearing, I'd catch myself checking the mailbox warily, expecting another envelope. It took time to trust the quiet again. But each day that passed without fresh threats felt like air returning to a room. One Sunday late in April, I saw Ms. R walking her dog past my house. The road was wet with melt, and birds were finally loud enough to compete with the distant plows. She glanced toward the backyard, saw the shed standing. Our eyes met for a beat. She smiled that brochure smile, but it didn't reach the rest of her face. I smiled back, polite and calm. Not because I liked her. Because I didn't need to prove anything anymore. I'd won in the only way that matters with an association like this, by making them follow their own rules and survive the fact that I wasn't afraid to read them out loud. And the shed? It stayed, doing what it was always meant to do, quietly holding up the weight of mountain life. Tell me your HOA horror in one line, especially if a rule tried to erase your home.